welcome back to the channel. So who is this video for? This video is for you if you've already been at least a little bit introduced to React. So you know that React is a front-end library, you know that it uses something called JSX, which looks a lot like HTML. You know that it lets us break down our code into separate components, and you know that components have something called state. And the updating state is what lets the app, update in real time. So you've at least heard of all of those big picture concepts before, but the actual details and syntax and specifics of working with state, maybe you could use some help there. And not just how state works in really simple examples, but how state works when you need to share it across multiple components that are nested different layers deep, so on and so forth. Now, before we get started, I want to share a little bit of my philosophy, and that is that I think the hardest part of learning React is avoiding the pitfall of trying to learn 10 things at once. So React starts out simple, but as your app gets more complex and you start reaching for some of the power tools that React offers, it's easy to get wrapped up in trying to do things the right way and the powerful way all at once. What I mean is that when you reach for one power tool that React offers, it probably has synergy with another power tool, and then the combination of those two together probably synergizes really nicely with another power tool, and before you know it, you've got 3 or 4 chainsaws going full speed, and it's loud, confusing, it's over-engineered, you're super confused, and you forgot what you were even trying to build in the first place. At that point, you're just going to give up, and we don't want that to happen, right? So what are we going to do in this video? We're going to start simple. React is easy when you start with the basics, and then we're only going to introduce one new problem and one solution to that problem at a time. By the end of the video, we'll be using all the cool power tools that React offers, like context and reducer, only you'll actually understand what's going on. So I think the hour-and-a-half time investment is worth actually understanding the tools in your toolbox. Let's get started. Okay, so to get started, if you like to actually follow along coding instead of just watching a video, you can find a link to this GitHub repo in the description for this video. So what's in this repo? Well, remember when I said that we're only going to introduce one new topic or one new problem or one new solution at a time? Well, that's why I've created these different subfolders. We're going to work through each one and learn one concept at a time before moving on. So without further ado, right now let's get started with this first folder called O1 Starter. So you can either just clone this repo or click on code, click download zip. Either way, if you get these files, I have this folder on my desktop. Here's that first folder, O1 Starter. Just go ahead and open this up in VS Code. Cool, so here are the contents for that folder. With a command line pointing towards that directory, I want you to run npm install. If you don't know what npm is, or if you don't have Node installed on your computer, then this video is not for you. That's okay. You might want to just go watch a different video on, getting Node installed on your computer. You would just visit the Node website. We're not going to cover that in this video. Cool, let's keep moving forward. So now that we've ran npm install, we can just say npm start. That's it. And now it's going to watch us. It's going to watch for when we make changes and automatically rebundle up our React code. So for example, if you go into your src folder and jump into index.js, around line number 8, we see a headline where it says, welcome to our app. You could add a few exclamations here just as a test. Click save. And now let's go preview that in the browser. So in your O1 Starter folder, if you go into the dist folder, just drag this index.html on top of your web browser window. Cool. So here is our React application. There we see the 3 exclamations. If you see that, that means your copy is working. And now we can actually get to the whole point of this video, which is learning about state. We don't need to go out of our way to make things academic or hypothetical or theoretical. We just need to bring this app to life. Because currently, if you click on these buttons, nothing happens. So to be clear, what is the goal of this app? Well, in this input field right here, you could say, you want the text to be 30 pixels. And then this text should change and it should appear as 30 pixels in font size. And then in this field, you could say green, and then this text should be green, right? Or you could click this button, and clicking that button will automatically set this value to be 20 and this value to be pink, so on and so forth. Now, we're displaying those values here on this text itself, But then we also want to display in the header, it should say the current size is 20 or 30, and then the current color is blue or pink. And then for the final detail, the header also says this page has been liked, X number of times. In the footer, you can click this button to increment that value. And then also in the footer, there's a button you can click to set the font size to 30, but it does not change the color value, just changes the font size value. Cool, so we've established our goal, what we're trying to build. Now the question is, where do we start? Let's begin by giving our app initial or default values for these dynamic pieces of data. So for example, when you first visit the app, let's say that the default font size is 15 pixels. And let's say the default color is green. Now, obviously, you could just set those values in HTML or CSS without any JavaScript whatsoever. But we're building, my cat just attacked me. We're building a real-time React application. So we want to set those values in a way so that if we update them in the future, our app just automatically re-renders based on those new values. So how do we accomplish that? Well, that's exactly what state is for. So let's just go create a piece of state. We can start with the size of the font. So back in our code, around line number 4, here's our overall app component. So within the body of this function, we would just say const, we're making up a variable, square brackets, because we're actually going to destructure multiple values from an array. Don't worry, this will make sense in about 20 seconds from now. But in these square brackets, we can make up a variable name. I'll make up a name of size. There's nothing special about this. This could be unicorn or pizza, but I'll say size, comma, set size. Now we're going to set that to equal, and then we're going to call react.useState. In these parentheses, we can provide a default value. So let's just say, 15 is the default font size. Now, when we call React's useState, what is it going to return? What is it going to give us? It gives us an array with 2 different values in it. So that's why we're destructuring it. The first thing it gives us is the actual value, right? So in this case, it would start out as 15. And then the second thing it gives us is a function we can call to update or change the value if we want to in the future. Now, just to reduce a little bit of typing, you don't have to spell out react.useState. Instead, you can create sort of a shortcut for yourself. So up here, when we're importing React, we could say comma, curly brackets, use state. And now we don't need to type out react dot. We can just access use state directly now. Cool, let's do the same thing now for the font color. So on a new line, I just say const square brackets, maybe color, comma, set color equals use state. Let's give it a default value of green. Okay, now let's actually use those dynamic values in our header. So when we say, the current size is blank, instead of blank, it would be curly brackets for something dynamic, and then size, right? That's what this first property is. Do the same thing for color. So this would be curly brackets, color. We can give that a save. If we refresh in the browser, perfect. So the current size is 15, green. Let's also go use those values on this area so that it's actually green and 15 pixel font size. So back in our code, we're looking for this div around line number 24 that has a class name of main area. So after the quotes, but still on this opening div tag, I would just say style equals curly brackets. In these curly brackets, we can include another pair of curly brackets, and now we can just say color colon, right? So the name of the CSS property, and then we just happen to name it color. So color color. In modern JavaScript, if the name of your property is the same name as your value variable, you can just say color once, comma. Let's set the font size. So it would be font size, right? This is the JSX equivalent of the CSS property font dash size, colon. And for example, you would set this to a number and then px, right? You could use rem, but in this example, we're using pixels. Well, instead of quotes, if we use backticks, then we can just hollow out this hard-coded number with a $ curly brackets to do something dynamic, and then you can just say size. So if we give that a save and refresh, cool. This text is now green and it's the 15 pixel default. To test it out, up at the top, you could adjust these default values. So you could bump this up to 25 and say that the default color is sky blue. Give that a save, refresh, you get the idea. So we've learned how to use the current state value, but now the question is, how do we change or update the state values? To answer that, let's first set up these input fields so that they show the current value, and then we'll work on setting things up so that anytime you change the value of these input fields, we actually update our pieces of state. So back in our code, around line number 20, we see those two input fields. So on the first input field, I would just say value equals. And now if you're wondering when you should use quotes versus when you should use curly brackets, it's simple. If you're just giving it a simple string value, you would use quotes. But if you want to use a variable or like an actual dynamic JavaScript value, that's when you use curly brackets. So we would want this to be our piece of state. So a variable, I'm going to use curly brackets. So that would just be size. And then on this input, value equals curly brackets, color. Save that, refresh, perfect. Now let's set up on-change event listeners or event handlers so that when you click in this field, you can actually change the value. Because currently, if you try to click into this field, it won't even let you change the value. This is because we've told it that its value should always be in sync with state. So in order to change the input field now, we would need to change the state value. So let me show you how we can do that. Let's start with the size. So on this input field, we would give it a React property of onChange equals curly brackets. And now you give it a function that you would want to run anytime the value changes. Now to be clear, in these curly brackets, we're not calling or executing a function, we are providing a function. And then React will actually call or execute it at the appropriate moment. In other words, in order to change the state, we know that React gave us this function called setSize. So we know that in some way or another, we want to call that to change the size. So we might be tempted in these curly brackets to just say setSize, parentheses, and give it a new value. But that would execute immediately as soon as the browser interpreted this code. Instead, we don't want to call the function. We want to provide a function, and then React will call it at the appropriate moment. So you could type out an anonymous or arrow function here, or you could create a function and then just point towards it. So let me show you what I mean. Within our component function, maybe right about here, we could say function, and you could give it any name, maybe handle, size change, parentheses, curly brackets, right? And then you would just point towards that function. So on change in the curly brackets, handle, size change. So React is going to call or execute our function at the perfect moment. Now, in these parentheses, let's have an incoming parameter. You could name it anything. I'll name it E. Now, in the body of our function, this is where we would want to call setSize. So we'd say setSize. We wouldn't want to just hard code it to 40 or 50 pixels. We'd want whatever value the user has actually typed into this input field. So that's why we included this incoming event parameter. So you can just look inside that. So e.target. So that's the HTML element that triggered this event. And then you can look inside that for its value. So e.target.value. So altogether, if we save that and refresh, and now if I change this to be 30 pixels or 40 pixels, you get the idea. So in real time now, this is pretty cool. It's updating not only the text itself, but our header is also getting updated. So that's the whole idea of state, right? You update a little piece of data and your entire application reacts to that change in real time. Let's do the same thing for the color. So let's find the second input. Now you absolutely could do the same thing and go create a separate function, but this time around, let me show you how you could just write an anonymous or arrow function. So on this second input, you could say onChange equals curly brackets and just have an arrow function. So the one parameter would be the event, arrow symbol, and then in the body of the function, we don't need curly brackets if we're just on one line with one statement. So just set color, parentheses, give it e.target.value. Give that a save. If we refresh, I can go into this field, and if I change it to green or yellow or orange or purple, perfect. It's updating both here and here. Practice makes perfect. So now let's work on this button that you click that changes both properties at the same time. Right? It sets the size to 20 and the color to pink in one click. So to do that, I would find that button. Here it is. I would, on the opening tag, say on click equals curly brackets. And let's point towards a function that we can create in about 5 seconds from now. So I'll call it maybe our button handler. And then let's just go create a function with this name. So right below our handle size change, I'd say function our button handler. In the body of our function, I would just say set size 20, set color pink. Now, you don't need to worry, this is not going to cause multiple re-renders. React is smart enough that inside of an event handler, if you call two different set state functions, it will batch them. It will perform all of them in one re-render cycle. So this is perfectly efficient, nothing to worry about. We can go ahead and save that, refresh. If I click the button, cool. We changed the size and the color at once. Let's move on to the footer. So you click this button and it changes just the size to 30 pixels, but it leaves the color alone. So down in the footer, for me, that's around line number 36. Here we see that button. I would just on the opening tag say on click equals curly brackets. Let's have an arrow function. So parentheses, arrow symbol, and then just say set size to 30. Give that a save. We can reload. If I click that button, perfect. Finally, for our last detail in this initial project or folder, let's work on this like count incrementer. So up in the header, it says this page has been liked blank number of times. Down in the footer, you can click this button and that number should go up by 1 each time you click the button. So to set that up, I would just create another piece of state. So up at the top, underneath size and color, I'd say const square brackets, maybe call it like count, comma, set like count equals use state. You could give it a default value of 0. Okay, then down in our footer, here's that button, like the page. On the opening tag, say on click equals curly brackets. Let's give it an arrow function. So parentheses, arrow symbol. This would be set like count. Now, if you knew the exact number that you wanted to set here, you could just feed this a number. But because we want to base it on the previous value, right, whether that was 0 or 100, we just want to take the previous value and add 1 to it. So when you're using one of these set state functions that React gives to us, you can give it a value or you can give it a function to access the previous value. So let's give it an arrow function with exactly one parameter, and that one parameter is the previous value. So that way we can actually work with it. So arrow symbol, right? Now we're in the body of our function, but we can access this. So then it would just be that plus 1. We can give that a save. If we refresh, let me zoom out a little bit. If I start clicking this button, whoops, I forgot to update our header so that this is actually pulling from state. So back in our code up at the top in our header around line 26, this page has been liked. Instead of hard coding that to 0, we would just say curly brackets, like count. If I give that a save, try it again. Now when I click this button, perfect. You can see this number gets incremented each click. Okay, so that does conclude our first example in this video. Before we move on to the next example, if I move too fast and you're lost, that's okay. That's the entire point of this O2 folder. So it doesn't contain anything new. It's just the finished product of everything that we just typed in the last 10 minutes. So the O2 folder is a working example that you can reference. So if things are cloudy and confusing right now, I'd encourage you to pause the video, experiment with things in the first project until they work and make sense. You can use this folder as a reference if you need to. You can always watch this first portion of the video again a second time until the idea of setting state and updating state makes sense. Okay, but once that concept does make sense, we're ready to move on to the next example. So what topic are we going to cover in this O3 folder? Well, there's one huge problem with the app that we just built. What is that problem? Well, if we look at our code, the problem is that our entire application is just one big single giant component. Now, yes, our app was so simple that it's still only 50 lines of code. But the point is, you could use your imagination. In the real world, your app might be complex and it might be hundreds or thousands of lines of code. And the idea is that you would want to split it up into bite-sized chunks, or you'd want to split it up into multiple components. instead of just the one overall app component containing everything itself. So for example, this area could be its own totally separate component called sidebar. And this area could be its own totally separate component called main area. This could be its own component called footer, so on and so forth. Now, for the next 20 or so seconds, you do not need to follow along with the code I'm about to type. But for example, I'll show you how you could set up the main area as its own component. So down in our code, again, you don't need to make these changes in the next 20 seconds, but I could delete this div that has a class of main area and instead point towards an imaginary component that I haven't actually created yet called main area, sort of a self-closing HTML looking tag like this. And then in React, all that a component is just a function that starts with an uppercase letter. So down below, I can just say function main area parentheses curly brackets. You just have it return a bit of JSX. So I could just return a div that says, hello, this is the main area. But the idea is that all of the actual code, maybe if it was hundreds or thousands of lines of code, that could live in this own totally separate component, right? So if I save this and refresh, it still works, right? Our overall app component is taking care of rendering that totally separate component called main area. So this approach is great. It lets you break up your app into reusable bite-sized areas, helps us stay organized. Different team members can be responsible for different components, but there's just one big problem. Well, it's not a problem, it's just an obstacle in our learning, our understanding. And that is that now, since we're using separate components, working with state just got way more complicated. Because now, within this main area, within that separate component, by default, before we take matters into our own hands, we have no way of accessing the state data of the font size and font color. This is because in React, a component cannot access state that was born in a different component, in another component. A component, until we take matters into our own hands, can only access its own state that originated inside of it. This means that in order for our main area to actually access those values of, the color equals green, the size equals 15, we are going to need to manually and explicitly pass those values from our overall app component down into our main area separate component. Now, doing that is not rocket science, and it's exactly what we're going to learn how to do in our next example. So, back to the question of what in the world is going on in this O3 folder? Well, I've already taken the time to split our different areas in our app into separate component files, much like you'd find in the real world. So, right now I want you to change gears with me. In your command line, you can stop the task that's currently running, press Ctrl-C. You can close this instance of VS Code, and I want you to open up this O3 folder in VS Code instead. Cool. So with the O3 folder open in the command line, pointing towards that new folder, you can just say npm install, and then go ahead and run npm start. Cool. So now you'd need to open up that file in your browser. So basically, go into O3 folder, go into the dist folder, and just drag the index.html on top of your browser. Cool. Now we're back to square one. None of the buttons work, only now we've set things up in a way where there's actually individual separate components. So let me show you what's going on. If we open up the src folder, you'll see there's a new folder named components, and it has footer, main area, and sidebar. So for example, if you click on sidebar, there is the HTML or JSX for that component, right? It's just a JavaScript file that's importing React. Down at the bottom, we're just exporting our function, right? That's all a component is. It's just a function that returns JSX. In our overall file, so in the index.js in the source folder, we still have our app function, right? The overall component that's getting rendered. And then if you look in its JSX, yes, here's the code for the header, but then you'll notice down below, everything else is split up into its own little bite-sized component. If we scroll up just a little bit, you'll see that I left these lines intact, right? So the state for size, color, and light count still lives within the app component. And because I didn't split out the header to live in its own separate component, That means it's very easy to access the state from this location. Right, so we could hollow this out. The current size is curly brackets, size, and the current color is, hollow that out, color. And the like count instead of 0 would be, like count. So if you save that and refresh, that's easy enough, right? Now our header is actually using those values. That was super easy because we're in the same component where that state was born, where it was originated from. Now the question becomes, inside our separate main area component, right, this area, how do we access those state values? Well, there are multiple ways of achieving that, but let's start with the most basic way. So in our index.js file, in our overall template, right, when we're including the main area, we can just give it a prop. So for example, we could say, color equals blue. And size equals, let's say, 20. Only we wouldn't hard code these values like this. We could just pass it. We could just give it the actual state values. So it would be, color equals curly brackets, our piece of state named color. Size equals curly brackets, our piece of state named size. So let's save this, and then we just need to go into our main area component and use these props, these properties. So in the components folder, jump into main area.js. Before we change this code at all, you want to be sure that on the opening function line in these parentheses, let's have a parameter. You can name it anything, but the industry standard is to name it props. Now in the body of our function, we can access that. So on the opening div tag, we would just say style equals curly brackets. This outer pair of curly brackets is to do something dynamic. We want another pair of curly brackets inside that for an object with multiple properties. So color, the CSS property, would just be props.color, right? Those incoming properties. Comma, we can have another property called font size, colon, and then string of text, 13 pixels, but we would want it to be dynamic. So instead of quotes, I'd make these backticks, hollow out the 13 with $ curly brackets, and this would just be props.size. Let's give that a save. If we refresh, awesome. Let's work on making the sidebar component come to life. It's going to be a little bit more work because it doesn't just need to read the incoming state, it needs to be able to change and update the state. So we're going to have to pass more things into it. Let's start with populating these input fields with the initial values from state. So back in index.js, here's our sidebar component. I would just give it a prop of, color equals curly brackets color, size equals curly brackets size. Give that a save. Then jump into the sidebar component file. When we're defining the function in these parentheses, be sure to give it a parameter, props, right? React is going to pass that into our function as an argument. Now we can use it. So on this first input, I would just say value equals curly brackets props dot size, and then on this one, value equals curly brackets props dot color. Give that a save. Refresh. Perfect. However, now we need to set things up so that you can actually click into this input field and change it. So back in index, in addition to giving it the actual state values, we'd want to give it the functions that let you change those pieces of state. So set color equals curly brackets set color. As you might have guessed, set size equals set size. Give that a save, jump back into sidebar, set up this first one. So we'd say on change equals curly brackets. And remember, we're not calling or executing a function here. We're either providing a function or pointing towards a function that React will call for us at the right moment. So I'm not going to call set size directly. I'm going to first create an anonymous or arrow function and then call set, well, actually, we look in props, right? Props dot set size. Now, in order to access the value that the user has typed into this input field, we would need that event parameter. So E here, if you just have exactly one parameter, you don't need the parentheses around it. And then what would we set it to? It would be e.target.value. Let's do the same thing for this second input. To save some typing, you could just select this onChange equals curly brackets, just copy and paste that here. Really, the only thing you need to change would be, instead of set size, it would be set color. Let's give that a save and test it out. So now if I set this to 10 or 20 or 30, perfect. I can change this to orange, green, beautiful. Really quick, let's make this button come to life once again. So it should change both the size and color all at once. So on the opening button tag, I would say on click equals curly brackets. Let's give it an arrow function. And I want to do two things inside the body of this function, so two statements, so I do actually need the curly brackets. And if you're like me and you're using Prettier in VS Code, I think it's going to drop down in these curly brackets for you, so we might as well drop down. And I would just say props dot set size, set it to 20, and then we would also say props dot set color and set it to pink. Let's give that a save. You can see Prettier sort of changed the indentation and line breaks to look like this. But if we refresh, if I click this button, perfect. Practice makes perfect, so let's go ahead and set up the buttons in the footer. The footer doesn't need to be able to read any of the state values. It just needs the set state functions for set the font size and increment the light count. So back in our index.js file, here is the footer component call. So we would just give it a prop of set size equals set size, and then another prop of set like count equals set like count. Give that a save. Now let's jump into our footer component. Be sure to include a parameter of props. Cool, now we can access those. On this first button that says, make the text 30 pixels but leave the color alone, we would just say on click equals curly brackets, give it an arrow function. And then we would just look inside of props for set size, set it to 30. Okay, and then on this increment the light count button, we would just say on click equals curly brackets, give it an arrow function, props dot set like count. Instead of giving it just a numerical value, let's give it a function. That way React will give us the previous value, because we don't know what the previous value is, but we just want to add one to it. So we can give it an arrow function where there's exactly one parameter. We can call it prev for previous value, arrow symbol. We would just return, and if it's all on one line, you don't need the word return, right? So just the previous value plus 1. If I give that a save, test it out, refresh, click this button, cool, that bumps up to 30, click this button. Well, actually, let me zoom out so we can see. Yep, you can see the light count is going up. And that means we are done with this example, and we can now move on to the next example. If I moved too fast, that's okay. That's what this 04 separate files finished reference folder is for. So there's nothing new in this 04 folder. It's just the exact code that we just typed out over the last few minutes. Cool. So what's next though? Where do we go from here? Well, we're going to learn about something in React called context. But before we even get into that, let's first talk about a problem with the app that we just built. Right? So we don't even know what context is yet, but let's first talk about what problem it solves. So the problem with what we just built, if we jump into our index.js file, well, while we were just building this, you might have thought to yourself, hey, manually passing down props like this doesn't feel very fun or efficient. Now, sure, it was manageable because our app was so simple, but you can use your imagination and think that if our app was big and complex, passing props around like this could get very tiresome. For example, our app only required us to pass down these props one level. But imagine if, for example, our sidebar, what if it was comprised of multiple subcomponents itself? So you don't need to type this out, but check out this example. If I go into our sidebar.js file, what if inside of our sidebar, it was made up of separate components like sidebar area 1, and sidebar area 2. So what if for organizational purposes, we split it up into these multiple subcomponents? And then what if they needed to access the state of color and set color? Well, you would have to manually pass that down another layer deep. So you'd have to say, set color equals curly brackets props dot set color. And then what if this component was made up of multiple subcomponents itself? And they needed the state. You'd have to pass it down again. So it's sort of like our overall app component is the grandparent, and then our sidebar is the parent, and then this component, these two would be the children, but then they could have grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren. There's no limit to how many layers deep you want to go to keep your code organized, with different components. And if one of those deeply nested components needs a piece of state that originated way higher up in the family tree, well, it can get very annoying and very tiresome to pass that data down each step. So let me get rid of these. We don't need these. The question becomes, how can we solve this problem of state being difficult to share across multiple components that are all nested various layers deep? Well, the solution to this problem is something called context. Now, this 05 folder, this is actually the finished working reference for context, so we don't need to switch into it right now. We can keep working in the VS Code we already have open, and we can just convert this to use context instead. So right now, let's just jump into our index.js file, and big picture, ask ourselves, what in the world is context? Well, if we look at our overall JSX template, imagine if we had some sort of special wrapper component that we could wrap our JSX inside of. And then magically, any component that is nested inside of it, it doesn't matter if it's directly just one layer nested inside of it or, a great-great-great-grandchild 20 layers nested deep inside of it. Any component that lives inside this magical wrapper component can access values that it's offering. That is what context lets us set up. And right now, let me show you how we would do this. So the first step would be to create a new context. So maybe up at the top, even above our app function, right about here, let's make up a name. Let's have it start with an uppercase letter. So I'll make up a name of our context and just set it to equal react.createContext. Now, if you wanted to, you could create a shortcut for create context so that you don't have to type react dot. So up on the very first line when we're importing React in these curly brackets, you could just say, comma, create context. And then you could just call that directly here. Cool. So we have something called our context. Now, how do we use it? Well, check this out. When we're returning our JSX, let's wrap all of our JSX, the entire template of JSX, inside a wrapper component. So right about here, I would say our context dot uppercase provider. Now, VS Code is going to try to add the closing matching tag for that right here. We don't want that. We would want that to be at the very bottom, right? We want this to be the wrapper element or, wrapper component. So I would just take this closing tag, just cut it, and then include that down here at the very bottom. Cool. So we have wrapped everything inside of our context.provider. Now, check this out. On this opening provider tag, we can say value, oops, that should not be uppercase, value equals quotes hello. This could be anything. It doesn't have to be a string of text. It could be a number. It could be an object. We're just giving it a prop. Now, I didn't make up this name of value. This prop needs to be named value. But the idea is that now any component that lives inside of this, right, and it doesn't matter if it's a direct child or a great-great-great-great-grandchild 20 layers deep, it can super easily access this value. So now instead of just a string of text that says hello, let's have this value be something useful. So for example, down on our sidebar, let's stop manually passing color equals color. So let's get rid of that prop. And as soon as I save this, that's going to break our application, right? Because now the sidebar, if I refresh, well, the entire app isn't broken, but you can see that input field no longer can receive that value. So now that our sidebar is no longer accessing the color value, let's adjust our context provider so that that's the value it's offering, right? The color piece of state. So we could say value equals, instead of quotes, just value equals curly brackets, color. So now the question becomes, within our sidebar.js file, how do we access this? Well, if our sidebar component, if the function definition for this lived in this same file as index.js, this would be super easy. Essentially, in this component of sidebar, we need to be able to access this object, this variable. Right up at the top, when we created the context, we named it our context. We need to be able to access this in order to use the context provider's value. So again, if the sidebar component function lived in this same file, accessing this global variable would be a piece of cake. But in the real world, you usually split things up so each component is its own file. So with that in mind, I say that we just create a separate file where we create the context, and then we can import that file in both our index and in sidebar. So let me show you what I mean. Inside our source folder, I would just create a new file and name it our context.js. In this brand new empty file, let's just import curly brackets, create context from React. Then let's make up a name. So const, we'll call it our context equals create context. And then that's what we want this file to export, so we can import it from other files. So we would just say export default our context. Give that file a save, and now we can jump back into index.js. And this line where we had const our context, get rid of that, and instead we can just say import our context from quotes / our context. So we're just pulling that in from a separate file. And the real reason we did that is so now we can go into our sidebar file and also import that file. So that way we're working with the same context, right? So we can say up at the top, import our context from, this time it would be quotes / to go up a folder, right? Up out of the components folder, so back into the src folder, and then we can pull in our context. Cool. So now how do we leverage this in this file? Well, check this out. Inside of our function, but before the return line, right about here, we can just make up a name, say const, and you could make up any name you want. Pizza, unicorn, I'll name it color, and say that it equals, and then we use something called react.useContext. In these parentheses, you say which context you want to use, and that would be our context, right? That's why we imported it here. And this is going to give us whatever we spelled out in the value prop back in our JSX. So that's why I named it color, right? Because that's what we provided. So now down on this second input field for the value, instead of props.color, you could literally just say, whatever you named this variable here when we're consuming the context. If I give that a save, and if I refresh, perfect. You see that value actually appears here. Now, the reason this is cool is because our sidebar could have been 20 layers nested deep inside of our overall app component. It doesn't matter. No matter how many layers deep you are, leveraging and consuming context is always this simple. Now that we've seen context in action like this, let's take things a step further. So let's go back into index, and in our JSX, when we're using sidebar, let's get rid of all of these props. So just get rid of every single prop that we were passing into sidebar. And let's instead adjust things so that sidebar can access all of those things through the power of context. So in other words, on our context provider here, we wouldn't just want the value to be a singular property of color. We instead want to provide multiple values. Now on the provider, you can only have this one prop called value, but what we can do is just in these curly brackets, just provide another pair of curly brackets and just spell out an object with multiple properties. Now, before we go on, I do want to say that there is a caveat in React regarding spelling out an object literal like this when you're working with a context provider. In certain situations, this can cause unnecessary re-renders. Don't worry, we'll talk about that a bit later in the video. We will address it, but for now, don't worry about it. So let's just spell out the object here. So we know we would want color. So you could say color the name of the property and then the value, and that's our variable name. But remember, in modern JavaScript, if the name of the property and the name of the variable value are the same, you don't need to spell that out twice. You can just say color. So then we'd also want set color, comma, size, comma, set size. And while we're at it, why don't we also just include like count and comma set like count. Cool. So we're passing in this object with everything that a component could need. And our goal right now, we can go ahead and save that, is we just need to adjust our sidebar now to pull all of these values instead of trying to pull from props, right? Because we're not manually passing any props. So at the moment, if you refresh in the browser, I'm sure the sidebar component, is totally broken. So to fix this, just jump into sidebar. And now on this line where we're saying use context, it doesn't make sense to name this variable color. Why don't we name it instead just state? Or you could name it anything. You could name it tools or data. But the idea is that it's going to be that object that we just spelled out with all the different properties. So let's just go through and use that now. So on this first input, instead of this props.size, this would be state.size. And then instead of calling props.setSize, it would be state.setSize. On this line, instead of color, that would be state.color. Instead of props.setColor, it would be state.setColor. Cool, and then let's adjust the 20 pixel pink button. So instead of props, it would be state. Instead of props, state. Let's give that a save. If we refresh, it's looking good. Let me zoom in. I can click this button. Perfect. I can change this. Orange, yellow, green. Change this. 10, 40. Perfect. Now, practice makes perfect. So let's go into index.js and let's do the same thing for main area, right? The idea is that we don't need to manually pass props like this, so we can get rid of that. Okay, and then in our separate main area component file up at the top, we can just import our context. So import our context. You could just copy and paste this from sidebar if you wanted to, from quotes dot slash to go up a folder, our context. In our function, let's actually just copy that line to save some typing. So back in sidebar, you would just reuse this line of code. So copy and paste that. And now we can access state. So in our code, instead of props.color, this would be state.color. And then this would be state.size. You can give it a save, refresh. Cool. Still works perfectly. Let's do the same thing for footer. So back in index.js, let's get rid of these props on footer. We can save that. I would jump into main area, copy this line so I don't have to retype it. Up at the top of footer, just paste that in. I would also recycle this line so I don't have to retype that. Just include that in our function here. Okay, now we can use state. So on this button, instead of props, it would be state.setSize, and this would be state.setLikeCount. Save it, refresh it, click this button, bumps up to 30. Let me zoom out, click the increment button. Perfect. Now that would conclude our chapter in this video on context, but remember, I did promise that I'd talk about the caveat with context in terms of the value you provide being an object instead of just a primitive value like a string of text or a number. So let's talk about that caveat right now. We can actually visit the official React documentation on the topic of context. And if you perform a Control F or Command F on the page for caveat, here we see the subheading caveats. Now, what is React trying to warn us about right here? Essentially, in this example, they're just trying to let you know that on your context provider, if the value that you're providing is an object, right, instead of just a simple primitive value, well, that can trigger unintentional re-renders in any components that are consuming that context. Now, don't worry, I don't expect that to make sense, because in order for this explanation to make any sense, you would already need to understand the way that React handles re-renders by default versus the way that it handles re-renders on memoized components. Now, what I just said, I don't expect that to make sense yet. So hear me out. What I'm trying to say is that in order to have this explanation make sense, we need to go on maybe a 5 or 10 minute tangent. But I think that tangent is going to be worth it because I want you to actually understand the tools that you're using. So to have this topic of unintentional re-renders make sense, we need to talk about how React re-renders things by default. So let's get practical. Let's jump back into our code, and I want you to go back into index.js, and let's do something that has absolutely nothing to do with context. So in our overall JSX template, down below footer, but still in that overall div, let's just make up a new component called extra footer. Okay, and then we don't need to create a separate file. We can just create the function definition for extra footer right here, right? So just its own top level function. Let's say function extra footer, parentheses, curly brackets. Let's just have it return a bit of JSX with a div, and let's have a paragraph that says cat name, colon. Let's just have a blank X placeholder. Do the same thing for, dog name, blank. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. And if we refresh, cool, down at the bottom, cat name, dog name. Now let's get onto the topic of re-renders in React. So in this functional component, before we return anything, just at the start of our function, I want you to say console.log, and let's just have a string of text and say, imagine this function is slow or expensive to run. Let's go ahead and save that, refresh, and open up your browser's console. Okay, so we see that message in the console once because the page ran. However, if I do anything on the page, if I click this button to make the text pink, we see that message ran again. And if I click the like increment button 5 times, the message ran 5 additional times. So that means our functional component is getting recalled or re-executed every single time the overall app component changes. And this has nothing to do with context. This is just how React handles things by default. Anytime a component re-renders, so in this case, I'm talking about our overall top-level app component. When its state changes, it itself is going to re-render, but in React, that means any of its children components are also going to get re-rendered. So because our extra footer component lives inside the overall app component, anytime the app component changes, our extra footer function is going to run again and again and again. Now, before you start stressing out that this might sound inefficient, let me calm your mind. It's not actually re-rendering anything to the physical DOM of the browser. Working with the browser's DOM is super slow compared to just performing computations in memory. So rest assured, even though React is, re-executing our component again and again and again, it's not terrible for performance because it doesn't actually touch the browser's real DOM unless it detects a difference between the virtual DOM and the result of all of our components and the actual physical DOM of the browser. In other words, every time React is rerunning this function, our function is returning the exact same result, so that wouldn't cause a difference in the DOM. So nothing is actually getting physically re-rendered. So we're not causing a slowdown. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that when you hear the word render in React, it can actually mean 2 different things. So there's the traditional obvious meaning behind the word, right? When we think of render, we think of the DOM actually getting updated. But then there's the React internal version of the word render, which just means that a functional component is getting executed again. And that's the type of accidental re-render that the context caveat is warning us about. Okay, but if anytime a parent component changes, any and all children components are re-rendered like this anyways, what is the caveat trying to warn us about? Well, that brings us to the real heart of this tangent, which is something called memoization. What in the world is memoization? Well, let's get into that. So you might be wondering, why does React internally re-render every component every time? Well, one of the reasons why is that because for a lot of components we create, the function that powers them, so in this case, this footer right here, that this is going to be computationally cheaper or faster to just execute again and again than it would be to first check to see if anything new is being given to it so that it would have an actually different result. However, not all components are going to be super cheap and quick to run like this. Sometimes you will actually have a component that is doing something computationally heavy or that's going to return a huge amount of JSX. And in that case, you actually would want to avoid running that function if at all possible. Right? You would only ever want to rerun that function if it was actually necessary. If it was being given new incoming arguments so that it would actually return something new and different. And getting React to behave that way for a specific component is actually pretty simple. So maybe right above our function definition, we can just say const, and let's make up a name. I'm going to call it memoized extra footer equals react.memo. In these parentheses, you give it a regular component. So extra footer. So we essentially just created a different version of this component that now React knows that it should only actually re-execute it if it's being given new input so that it would return something new. So then this is what we would use up in the JSX. So instead of extra footer up here, it would be memoized extra footer. If we give that a save, if I refresh, yes, we see that message once when the page first loads, but now if I click any of these buttons again and again and again, you see it's never getting called again unnecessarily. Now, it's not like our component is frozen in time. If you actually gave it a different prop, right? If it actually had different input or different values to work with so that it would actually return something different, then it actually will get called again. So if you gave it a prop that was going to change over time, or better yet, if it consumed a context provider. So for example, in our extra footer function, if I say const and just make up a name, example equals react.useContext, and then use our context, right? So now this component is consuming or it's subscribed to the context provider. Now if I save and refresh, and if I click the increment button 5 times, you can see our component actually did get called and reran 5 different times. This makes sense. It needs to be ran again to make sure that it has the newest and latest values that the context is providing. Okay, so this situation does make sense of why it would need to update. And at this point, we are now finally in a position to understand the context caveat that the React documentation was trying to warn us about. So let's go back into the code. I'm going to stop consuming, or I'll unsubscribe to that context provider. So now this component is back to not needing to re-render every single time. Cool. However, and I promise this is the final conclusion of this explanation. Remember in this new component we said cat name and then we have these placeholder values? Well, what if this component wanted to consume a different context provider? So imagine in our overall JSX template, what if there was an outer overall different context provider that offered the cat name and dog name? So really quick, I'll just create it in this file because we don't need to import it anywhere else, but I'll just say const, animal names context equals react.create context, or we actually already have a shortcut for that. So just create context. Okay, and then in the overall JSX, if I add an outer wrapper called animal names context dot provider, move the closing tag to actually be at the bottom. Okay, and then for the value, if I say value equals, and now here we're finally getting to the caveat. If I give it an object inside the curly brackets of, let's say cat name is meows a lot, comma, dog name is barks a lot. Okay, and then let's go subscribe or consume to this context provider within our new component. So down at the bottom in extra footer, if I say const names equals react.useContext animal names context, right? And then I could actually use those values here. So instead of the X placeholder, it would be names.catName, and this would be names.dogName. If I save that and refresh, cool, we see those names down here, meows a lot and barks a lot. However, those values are never going to change, right? Nothing is set up in a way so that these values of meows a lot and barks a lot are pieces of state. They're not subject to change. So it really wouldn't make sense for this function to need to re-render again and again. However, unfortunately, if I click the like button 5 times, we can see that our extra footer function got recalled and re-executed 5 times. So why? Why is that? Right? You might be confused because we're giving it the exact same incoming values. This isn't changing. It's still the exact same properties and values, but the reason it's rerunning, and this is the caveat that React was trying to warn us about, is because think about where this line of code lives. It lives in the app component. And anytime the state of the app component changes, so anytime we change the size, the color, the light count, that's going to call this function again, the overall app function. So then this line of code is going to run again, and it's going to see that we spelled out this object literal, and React is going to consider this a new value, right? Because we're creating this object each time this line of code runs. Now, if what you were including here as your value is just a primitive value, like a simple string of text or a number, React can perform that comparison and realize that the value hasn't changed. But this syntax of actually spelling out an object, due to the way that React performs a shallow comparison, it's just going to see this and assume, hey, this is a totally new object each and every time. So that's what the React documentation is warning you about. If you have a memoized component, be careful. Right? If you're using an object on the context value, you might be needlessly re-executing that function again and again and again. Now, an easy way to solve this would just be to move this object into state, right? Because if something lives in state, React is really good at remembering it. So, for example, if I just took this object, cut it into my clipboard, and then said, const names, set names, right? If I just created a piece of state, so use state, the initial value is that object. Now React can hold on to this value in between re-renders, and it will know that it hasn't actually changed. So now if we just provide for the value names, give it a save, refresh, we still see those values, but now I can click this button as many times as I want. Our function knows that it doesn't need to rerun again, right? Because it's not getting any new input that would lead to different output. Okay, and that concludes our context example. If you want a working reference, that's what this O5 context folder is. So there's nothing new in this folder, it's just for your copy and paste or reference purposes. Anyways, at this point, we are ready to move on to our final example and topic, which is something in React called reducer. Now, before we worry about what a reducer is, let's first discuss a potential problem with the way that our app is currently structured, right? In other words, what problem does reducer solve? So let's go look at our app. I'm going to jump into index.js and notice that all of our state lives in our app component, right? Our overall top level component. This is where we have size, color, light count. So they all live here, and this is great. It's easy to share them with children components. However, we might start to feel like it's a bit weird how our state is centrally located here in terms of where it's being created. But in terms of where we're updating our state, or in terms of where we're spelling out the logic and details of how and when it should or shouldn't be updated, all of that logic is spread out across who knows how many different files, right? It's not centrally located. So we've got, our footer.js file. And yes, it doesn't contain any super complex business logic, right? It's just providing a text size value and then it's incrementing a number by 1, but still, it has unique code for changing the state in a unique way. And then, our sidebar.js file, totally separate file. It also has its own logic and details of how state should change. Now, our app is really simple. There's not a lot of complex logic and decision making going into how the state should change, but you can use your imagination that in a big, large, complex project, you're going to have tons of different component files and more advanced logic of how the state should be changing. And maybe you don't want all of that to be spread out across so many different chaotic files. Maybe it would be nice if you could just have one centrally located place, right? So we have a centrally located place where we're creating the state. Maybe it would be nice if we could spell out all of the different ways that our state can change in one place, right? Our logic, our conditions, our different actions. We could wrap that up in a nice single package, and then all of our different child components can just talk to that package and say, hey, I'm just a child component in a random file. I don't know the details of how state should change. I'm just giving you a request. I'm dispatching a request to you. I'm saying, hey, here's the new color value, or here's the new font size value. It's up to you to do something with it, right? I'm just brainlessly giving you this value. You're the centralized logic tool that should actually take that value and update state in an organized way. Well, that's exactly what a reducer is in React. So right now, let me show you how we can adjust our application to use a reducer. So a reducer is all about working with state. So in other words, something in React called useReducer is an alternative to using useState. So up at the very top of this file, when we're importing React, and we had previously used something called useState, well, let's import something else. The ordering doesn't matter, but maybe right before it, import something called useReducer. Okay, now let's go leverage useReducer. So down in our app function, I would say const square brackets, and just like when you use useState, useReducer is going to return an array with 2 items in it. So we're destructuring that array. Let's make up variable names of state, comma, dispatch. Don't worry, I'll explain why we're choosing these names in just a moment. But let's say that equals, and then useReducer. Now in these parentheses, we're going to give it 2 things. So a comma b as placeholders. This first argument that we give it, so instead of this a placeholder, is a function. Now the idea is that when React calls this function that we provide it, it's going to give it everything that it should need to make its decisions. So the function does not need to live inside of our component function because it doesn't need to directly access any of our data, right? So the reducer function is going to be given input, and then it's just a pure function. It's going to return output. So let's create a function right above our app component. So right about here, the name doesn't matter, but I'll name it maybe our reducer function. Parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, and then instead of the a placeholder, that's what this would be, just a reference towards that function. So our reducer function. The second argument, instead of the b placeholder, is your initial state. So what should the values be by default? So right below that new function we just created, I would just make up a variable, say const. You can name it anything. I'll name it initial state equals an object. We didn't touch on this before. So earlier when we were setting up state, we set it up so that each piece of state was just one singular value, right? Like size is just one single number, color is just one single string of text. You don't have to set things up that way. useState can absolutely be used where the value is an object with multiple sub-properties. That absolutely can be done. However, even the official React documentation says that useReducer is usually preferable to useState when you have complex state logic that involves multiple sub-values. So in other words, you don't have to use useReducer, but if you want your state to sort of be lumped together in one unified object, then useReducer is sort of the right tool for the right job. But it's totally up to you how you want to structure your data in your app. Anyways, in our initial state, so in this object, I would just spell out the various properties. So I would say, the default value. So size, default value of 25. Color, default value of quotes, sky blue, comma, likes, default value of 0. Cool. And then that's what this second placeholder value of b should be. So it should be initial state. So now the question is, well, what does useReducer give back to us when we call it? Well, it gives us 2 things. That's why we have an array here that we're destructuring. The first thing is just state. That's simple enough, right? So you could say something like state.size to get this value, or state.color. The second thing it gives us is dispatch. What is dispatch? Well, it's going to be a function that you can call, and you can describe which type of action you're trying to dispatch. And the idea is that we can pass this down into our various components. For example, our footer can say, hey, I'm calling dispatch, and the type of action that I'm trying to dispatch is increment the like count. So it just has to pass a label that says increment likes, and then it will be up to our reducer function to see that label and go, oh, you're trying to increment the likes? And then it will perform the actual code to make that change in the state. If that doesn't make sense, that's okay. I think it truly won't make sense until we see an example up and running. The real idea here is that we want to pass both of these things, state and dispatch, into our application, like all of the subcomponents. Right? These are super useful things. It's not like we're just going to need to access them inside of app. We need our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to be able to access these. So this is where everything comes full circle. Let's just provide them with a context. I'm actually going to set things up so that there's one context provider just for state and then a different context provider just for dispatch. And at the end, we'll see why I would do something like that. Anyways, let's leave this our context provider in place, and that can be responsible for offering up our state. So for the value, it would just be value equals, we can get rid of all of this, right? We don't want two sets of curly brackets, just one, and just give it state. Okay, but now let's set up a totally different context provider and pass down dispatch. So to do that, I would just create a new file. Well, to save typing, I would just duplicate this our context file. So I would just take these 3 lines, copy them, create a new file in our source folder that lives right by our context, and just name it dispatch-context.js. Paste in your clipboard. Let's just change this from our context to be dispatch context. Save that. If you really wanted to, you could rename our context to be state context, but it doesn't matter. Back in index, let me go ahead and import that new file. So import dispatch context from quotes / dispatch context. Okay, now let's go add it in our JSX. So essentially, I would just create one more wrapper provider. So right about here, I would say dispatch context dot provider, move the closing tag to truly be down here. Okay, back up on our new opening tag. We give it a prop of value, curly brackets, dispatch. Cool. So now our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren components, it's up to them. They can choose to consume or subscribe to either one of these. The reason I wanted to split this up is because if we think of our footer, for example, right, this area, it doesn't need any of the state values. It only needs to be able to dispatch actions when you click on these buttons. But it's not actually reading or loading, the size value or the color value. We'll get more into that in just a moment. And speaking of this footer, let's go set it up first to use our new approach. Let's set up this increment like count button. So let's jump into our footer.js file. And up at the top, we don't need to consume or subscribe the our context any longer. Let's instead pull in dispatch context from the file named dispatch context. And then in our footer, let's say const, instead of state, let's change this to be, I'll name it dispatch. I think that's a fitting name. And then this would be dispatch context. Now let's go actually use dispatch. So down on this bottom button, when it gets clicked, let's leave the arrow function, but instead of calling, state.setLikeCount and actually spelling out how the state should change, instead of all of that, so I'd get rid of from state to this closing parentheses, all we would just say is dispatch, call it. Let's give it an object, and let's say the type is increment likes. And then let's also adjust this top button. So this button, when you click that, it sets the font size to 30. So again, let's leave the arrow function, but get rid of state.setSize call parentheses. Instead, we would just say dispatch, give it an object. Type would be, let's make up a name of change size, comma. Let's give it a property of value should be 30. So the idea is we're not actually changing the state in these files. We're just calling dispatch, and then it's going to be up to our reducer to see these labels and these values and change the state appropriately. Let's go ahead and save this file, and then jump back into index. And now we just need to set things up so that our reducer function actually has logic in it. So remember when we created that new empty function up here? In the parentheses for it, let's have two parameters, state, comma, action. Now, there's a million different ways you could set this up. You could write a bunch of if statements, but sort of the industry standard is to use a switch. So we'd say switch, parentheses, curly brackets, and then just spell out the different cases. But first of all, what are we switching based upon? Action.type. So remember in that last file when we said, type is increase likes or type is change size. Well, in this function, we're just going to perform different actions. We're going to change state in different ways depending on what type it is. So for example, let's spell out the case for when it's increment likes, colon, and we're just going to return what the new state should be. So in other words, how should the state change to represent this new action that just occurred? So I would just spell out a new object, right? This is what our state initially looked like. Now it's important to point out that React isn't going to perform any sort of object merging for us. So we need to spell out a new object in the same shape as our state, because we can't just directly mutate the existing state. We need to provide a new value and just give that to React. So in other words, in this new object that I'm spelling out, in order to save a bunch of typing, I'm going to use the spread syntax. So ... state. So that will sort of copy over or give us what the incoming previous state was. And then I can just customize things from there. So I'll say that likes should now be state.likes plus 1. Okay, now let's spell out the case for when you want to change the font size. So on a new line, it would just be case, quotes, change size, colon. We would return an object. We would return new state. Let's start with ... state. And then the only property that needs to change is size. And it should now be action.value. So remember when we called dispatch, we gave it the type, which was the label of the action you wanted to perform, and then we gave it a value. We said 30. So that's what we're setting it to. While we're here, we might as well just set up cases for change color. So new line, case for change color, colon, return an object, ... state. The color should now be action.value. And finally, let's set up a case for when in one action you want to change both the color and the size. So case for change color and size, colon, return, curly brackets, ... state. Color would now be action.value.color. Size would be action.value.size. I made some assumptions for this one. So when we actually dispatch and use this and call this, we'll just give it an object for value that has properties of color and size. Anyways, the idea is that this reducer function, it now has in one centrally located place the logic and the code that's actually changing the state in very specific ways. Now, in a more complex app, you could do whatever you needed to do in this function. You could have all of that complexity tucked away in this one centrally located place. Let's give this a save, and now we just need to adjust our application to use state and dispatch. So for example, if we scroll down in index to our overall JSX template, let's adjust our header, right? So instead of just pulling size, this would be state.size, and this would be state.color. This would be state.LikeCount. While we're at it, let's go ahead and delete these three lines. We don't need these individual use state lines anymore, right? Our reducer now holds that state. So we can just absolutely get rid of these size, color, and like count lines. I'm going to leave this names use state line in place because it was a totally separate example. Cool. So we've adjusted our header. Let's save this and go adjust our sidebar. So in our sidebar.js file, it's going to need both our context, which has the state, and dispatch, which has the dispatch. So let's import dispatch context from dispatch context. Let's be sure to set that up right here. So const dispatch equals react.use context, in the parentheses, just dispatch context. Cool. So let's start with the values. They don't even need to change. We were already naming it state. Cool, but we do need to change the function calls to now use our dispatch. So let's start with this size. So leave the arrow function and the e parameter, but get rid of state.setSize in the parentheses. Instead, it would be dispatch. We'd call that. We give it an object. Type would be change size, comma, and then value would just be e.target.value. Do the same thing for color. So leave the arrow function, get rid of state.setColor. Dispatch, give it an object. Type is change color, comma, value is e.target.value. Finally, we have the button that changes both the size and the color at once. Keep the arrow function, but get rid of these state.calls. Instead, we would just want to dispatch. The type would be change color and size. The value would be an object, and it would have properties, right? So color would be a string of text of pink, and size would be 20. Let's save that and go adjust our main area. So main area.js. It doesn't need to import the dispatch, right? It's sort of a read-only component. And we got lucky because we were already naming this state. We actually don't need to change anything in this file. If we go back to the browser and refresh, I can click the 20 pixel pink button. I can increment the likes. Whoops, that's actually not working. And you can see the value isn't even being pulled up in our header. So let's go back into our index.js file. And this is actually a great example of why reducer is useful. So I had said likes, and in our initial state likes, but remember throughout this entire video, we were calling it like count instead of likes. So in our initial state, change this from likes to like count. And then in our reducer, for the case of increment likes, this would be like count and state.like count. The reason this is good that we're using a reducer is because imagine if I made that same mistake spread out across, 30 different files that were all spelling out the actual code that changes the state. But because we're using a reducer, I can just fix my mistake in this one centrally located place, and it's perfectly fixed. The idea is you're sort of moving all of the complexity and detail into one repeatable, centrally located piece of code. So if we save that, I can refresh. Now I can increase the likes. Perfect. I can also click this 30 pixel footer button. Awesome. Now for the one final example in this video before we really close things out, I want to show you a real world example of why I set up different context providers for state and dispatch. So let's revisit the memoized component idea. So let's assume that this footer is also, for some reason, really expensive and slow to run. So check this out. If we go into footer, and in this function we said console.log, imagine our footer is slow. And then down at the very bottom of this file, if instead of just exporting footer, we instead exported react.memo footer, right? A memoized version of this component. Well, because we only consumed and subscribed to the dispatch context, that means this function is not going to have to rerun every time state changes, only when dispatch changes, which dispatch doesn't really ever change. So in other words, if you have components that you really don't want re-rendering all the time, it's a great idea to split your context providers into separate chunks. So then, the children and grandchildren can choose which ones to consume and subscribe to. So now, if we save and refresh, we see this, imagine our footer is slow. We see that once, but we are free to use the application, and that function does not get called again and again. And that does bring this final example to a close. Now, I know we moved pretty quickly, so if you want a copy and paste finished working product reference, that's what this 06 reducer folder is for. All right, and before we bring this video to a close, I do want to say that while we learned new ways of sharing state across an app, please don't think that this means you have to lift all of your state up to your topmost component. So what I mean is, if a component has state that only it would need and it doesn't need to be shared anywhere else in your app, then just simple local state for just that component is probably the cleanest solution. So the idea is that not everything needs to be globally available, right? We don't want to be like someone who's in their first week of learning to program, and so they make all of their variables global so that they're easy to access everywhere. Certain things need to be global, yes, sure, but not everything. An example that the official React website gives is, whether the visitor wants the website to use a dark or light theme. Another thing to consider when using context is that it hurts the reusability and portability of a component, because if a subcomponent relies on context that it's consuming, now it can only be used inside of that context provider wrapper. Now, in some situations that doesn't matter. In other situations, you are going to want your components to be super reusable and portable. So I guess the moral of the story is context can be really useful, but it's not the right tool for every situation. So big picture, all of the concepts that we learned in this video, you don't need to use them in a 100% global fashion, right? So as you break your app up into different components, a subcomponent can use one of these techniques. So for example, if your sidebar was super complex, it could have its own reducer or context provider, right? So you can use these ways of sharing state on a smaller, closer to home level. Not everything needs to be global, right? It's only when a piece of data needs to be shared across multiple components that are, nested different layers deep, that's when we, quote, lift state up to a more top level component. If you enjoyed this video about React State, you might also enjoy my 16-hour premium Udemy course all about React. So in this course, we build a real-world, simple social network application. We use React Router, there's a live chat feature, so on and so forth. So it's a bit more real-world instead of just really focused on state and nothing but state. In the description for this video, you can find a link to this page that has heavily discounted coupons for all of my premium Udemy courses. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you feel like you learned something, and stay tuned for more web development tutorials.